Today we will hear from two St. Thomas Wesley members, Barb Arop and Elaine Findlay, as they share a bit of their history and thoughts about anti-Black racism during this Black History Month of 2021. Elaine will begin the dialogue.
I am someone who was born in a white skin, whose ancestors came from Western Europe to these prairies where I have always lived. My grandpa was a homesteader, and I now recognize that means I'm a benefactor of stolen land. I have ancestors who came from Western Europe, and I've always lived on these prairies. And I was educated in an English-speaking colonial culture. Much of the history I learned about the settlement of this land during my growing up and even my adult years, I now recognize as being a lie. All of that history that I have means I absorbed into my being the racism and the white privilege inherent. It is challenging to recognize and name that racism and white privilege in myself and in my wider community and in my faith community and in all my living. And I know I don't always get it right. So, Barb, it's an honor and a privilege then to speak to you today about your history of living in 3 different countries with very different experiences. Can we begin by asking you to share your story? Where you were born and raised, what led to the moves you have made in your life, what experiences you have had that leads you to be speaking to us today about racism.
I'm Barbara Arop. I was born in what was then British Honduras, which was a British colony in Central America. And later on, when we became independent in 1981, the name was changed to Belize. I grew up there. It was actually under a colonial situation, because we were a colony. And because we were a British colony, we were inculcated with everything: the British language, British culture, British ideas, British government, British history. I remember particularly as a child in high school, I attended an Anglican girls' school, and we weren't allowed to speak our local language when we were on the school grounds. Well, once we stepped out of the gate, we could, but not while we were in school. We were expected, and it was enforced that we should speak only English. And I guess that was part of the whole business of the colonial, what should we call it, brainwashing, inculcating the British way. Mm-hmm. I remember learning British history. That's all we were taught. I never learned anything about history of Belize or history of the Caribbean or anything like that. It was always just British history. I knew more about Britain and British history, and even North American history, than I ever knew about, my own history. And I remember there are certain things that I still remember very, very vividly. I remember we had a governor, and on certain days when there were parades, we were celebrating, I don't know, Empire Day or something like that. The governor we were school children, we were all lined up along the road,
right,
waving little British flags. And this governor, he would be in the back of a jeep standing, and he was dressed all in white, and he had on this helmet with all these feathers that came down, and he would just we would be standing in the sun, burning in the hot sun for hours waiting for him to show, and all he did was just drive past. If we were lucky, he would wave. and and we would spend hours, because they would have to, all the schools would be let out, and they would take us, and we would all line up along the road for him to drive past. And I guess that's one of the vestiges of colonialism. And it seemed to me at the time that um, it was so unfair that we had to be in the hot burning sun for 2 seconds of seeing him ride past. But that was what was done. And I remember even our exams were, when I finished what would be the equivalent of grade 12 here, and we had to write our final exams, we wrote what were the Cambridge School Certificate exams. And the exam questions came from England. And then we had to write the exams, and then our papers were parceled and sent to England. And they were marked in England. And then 4 or 5 months later, the results would come. And we would know whether we succeeded or not. But most of the questions we learned about British history everything was from the British point of view, and everything was justified. We learned about Robert Clive in India. We learned about Sir Francis Drake and the Spanish Armada, and John Hawkins and Sir Walter Raleigh, and all these guys, Cecil Rhodes in in Africa. And later on, we came to find out that a lot of these guys were racist guys like Cecil Rhodes. Like, why were we learning about these guys like they were heroes? But at the time, we had no idea. No. This was how it was inculcated in us.
Yeah.
And so that's the background from which I came. And later on, I came to Canada in 1970, and I actually came to attend school. And it was completely different. And I remember at the time, back in 1970, there weren't as many people of color in Canada, at least in Toronto and Ontario, because I spent most of my time in Ontario. Like now, like if you go to Toronto now, there's so many different nationalities there. But it was like, if we were in Toronto and we would see another Black person, we would we would do a back take and say, oh my goodness, we want to talk to them, because it's not often we see someone Black like us, right? And it was like that. And then eventually I actually went and I lived in Nigeria for about 8 years. And then I discovered too that some of the things that they were under British rule as well, and had become independent long before us, because they became independent in 1960. We didn't become independent in Belize until 1981.
Right.
But I learned that to me, in my mind, I think the way I saw the British system, how the colonial system worked in Nigeria, was a lot more harsh than it was to me in Belize. When I look back at it, there was a lot of suppression and sort of playing off the different ethnic groups against one another, which wasn't so much done in Belize, but it was very, very, it affected their history so much.
Yes.
And then the British left, they got independence, and then they were left to govern themselves, but there was no real preparation for them to develop all the systems that would have made the independent period a success. And they actually went through a civil war because of the legacy of colonialism. Mm-hmm. One ethnic group was pitted against the other, and it resulted in, and that happens a lot in the whole continent of Africa. the colonial powers did the same. So that's some of my background.
Ah, lots of stories. Thank you. And I guess as we come together to talk about our histories today, it makes me reflect on what you know about the history of Blacks in Canada. And I know that as I look back, and I remember grade 6, we really focused on a history of the United States and learning all about the United States. And one of the things that we learned, quite a bit about was the slave trade and how that had evolved in the history of the States. And maybe I just don't remember, but I don't remember hearing that kind of similar history in my my school years, I guess, about Canada. And so I wonder what you know about the history of slavery in Canada, and if you might talk a bit about that.
Well, when I first came to Canada, I didn't know, I could say I hardly knew anything about the history of Canada. When I left Belize to come to Canada, people were very happy. They said, "Oh, you're going to a good country. There's no racism in Canada. It's not going to be like in the United States." So they were happy for me. And to be honest, I didn't really experience a lot of overt racism in my life as I came to Canada, went to school. Maybe because I was attending university and I wasn't really exposed to much discrimination and racism within that community that I was functioning in. I think the most racism that I encountered was when I was working, when I was in my employment, and I think it had to do with the nature of the work that I was doing. But I will say that later on, as I continued to live in Canada, and I had to seek this information out, then I discovered that there was a history of slavery.
Yes.
In Canada.
Yes.
And that there was racism, but it was like erased or invisible. You literally have to go searching for it to actually find the necessary information. But there is evidence that there were slaves, even from the very outset, because I learned that Canada was actually a French colony before New France, right. and they were slaves. The two countries that colonized Canada were the British and the French, right. And they were two of the countries that most indulged in slave trading. So it was inevitable that there would be slavery in Canada, but it's just not, the records are not there. It's not taught in the schools. It's not generally discussed in the media. It's just the odd program you might see on TV where someone explores that aspect of Canada's history. But right. Canada does have a very, in some cases, shameful history in terms of enslavement, because they started off enslaving the indigenous peoples. And then later on, when the British conquered the French, I think in 1760, then African slaves began to be brought in and sort of replaced the indigenous slaves. And well, slavery in any form, no matter what it is an unpleasant thing. It's because it involves they were treated as chattel, as property. They were not seen as being human. They had no rights. one of the things about slavery is that the African slaves, they were not allowed to speak their languages. They were not allowed to have their traditional names. They were renamed. So the whole thing was about stripping their identity. And like I said, they were treated as chattel. And I'm sure there was a lot of cruelty involved. So it's a horrible thing when you think about it.
Mhm. Yes, indeed. I wonder if you maybe have a personal story about racism that affected you personally or your family personally that you wanted to share.
I wasn't really. I don't consider myself to have been that adversely affected, but I do remember when I was living in Toronto, and I have 3 sons, and they were teenagers, and I remember having to talk to them and tell them, because at that time there were cases of the police shooting and killing
Right.
young Black men. And I do recall me and my husband at the time having to talk to our sons and instructing them how to behave if they were ever stopped by the police, and what to do and what not to do. And thinking that if they were out late, how safe they were, and being concerned until they showed up from wherever they were, and being relieved that they had made it home safely. And the thing is, because I consider that I raised them to be good citizens. That was the whole intent of living in Canada, that we would be good Canadian citizens. And I shouldn't have to worry that my children could be targeted, and that they could actually end up dead for something that they hadn't probably even done. So
Mm.
that was scary. And I also remember having to tell my children, you can't just be as good as your white counterparts. You have to be better because you are Black, in order to be successful, in order to have progress in your lives and in your chosen professions. You can't just be good. I always tried to inculcate that. And why? Because I always felt that if you were Black, you had to be better. You could not have an excuse to be laid off or to be denied a job. You had to be much better in order to compete, because the playing field was not level. And I felt that for myself, and I felt it for my children. Um, in terms of myself experiencing racism overtly, I experienced that mostly when I was working. I used to work for the city of Toronto in the social services department, and I was a caseworker. And one of my tasks was to take the application of people who were applying for social assistance. And it was my job to determine whether they were eligible or not. And I recall in so many cases where the person I would take an application from a white person, and mostly it was men, but there were a few women too. If I told them that they were not eligible, that they were being denied, they would lose their temper. And
Mm-hmm.
I've been called a lot of things. People would actually call me the N-word,
Well,
and I was called a dirty, stinking N-word, and I was called a Black monkey. And why did I have the right to deny them what they thought they were entitled to? And I had just come off the boat, things like that. The people would say stuff like that. and they would start railing and shouting and saying things about their ancestors had been in this country for so long, and here I was just a newcomer telling them what they could have and couldn't have. It didn't happen every time, but it happened frequently enough that I knew that if people would take out their anger on me, and it was considered part of the job, we were actually trained or told to just absorb whatever venting was going on, because I couldn't respond and say or respond to it, or you know give any kind of retort that would be considered unprofessional. So most of the time I would just stand silently while somebody was railing at me. And now I look back on it and I'm thinking that wasn't fair, but that was just how it was. And if it actually, I would get phone calls from people who were applicants and clients, and they would just rant and rave and curse, and and I would hang up. At a certain point in time, I would just say, no, I'm not taking it anymore. I'm hanging up. I would hang up on them, and they would call back, and I would pick it up, and they would say, "You can't hang up on me. You're my social worker, and you have to listen to what I have to say." And I say, "Yes, I'll listen to what you have to say, but I'm not going to take this abuse, this verbal abuse from you." And then they would start ranting and raving and cursing. I mean, ranting and raving I could handle. It was the cursing and the racial things that they would say that would make me want to hang up on them. But like I said, that was in the working environment, and I wasn't the only one that experienced that. So in terms of racism, in my personal life, I hardly experienced it, just in my work life.
Those are hard stories to listen to, Barb. Yeah. Makes my heart ache. I wanted to reflect a bit too about what's been happening recently, I guess, during COVID, and relating that to our history as a St. Thomas Wesley congregation who became an affirming congregation many years ago. And as part of that small group that undertook the study in order for us to become affirming, and it was a 3-year journey before we actually had a vote to declare ourselves an affirming congregation. But first of all, we wanted to educate ourselves. And of course, originally the affirming program came in concerned about sexual orientation and gender and so on, and trying to educate ourselves and others about the discrimination that happened in those ways with people who might belong to those groups. And we did that, but we also thought at St. Thomas Wesley that we really needed to look at other forms of discrimination as well, and we did. And we tried to educate ourselves about some of the other ways that people experience discrimination, and certainly racial discrimination or discrimination on the grounds of culture or economic position or whatever it was. And the United Church has fairly recently, within this year, during this time of pandemic, has made some statements, I think, in response to what happened in the United States initially with the death of George Floyd, and then with the demonstrations that happened. And there was a lot of violence and concern. And then as well, of course, we saw demonstrations in Canada particularly in terms of racial discrimination. And I guess it's given us pause for sure, and helped us to realize that we still have a lot to learn. And just as we think about this last year, I wonder if you have comments that you'd like to make about that.
Well, I think I watched on TV because we were all under quarantine
Yes.
at the time. But I watched on TV a lot of what was going on, and it was a long time coming. There's a program I listened to, and there's a Black speaker who said, Black people in the United States had been suppressed, brutalized, been discriminated against, murdered for so long. It didn't start with George Floyd. It started centuries before.
Yes.
But that the incident with George Floyd actually made Black people snap. It was so it triggered this overflow of anger and the emotions, and it was inevitable in a way. I watched that on TV. I watched that guy put his hands in his pocket and his knees on his neck.
Yeah.
A person that was not resisting. He was just lying there and he was helpless. And I remember at the funeral, they said, we'll pause for the 9 minutes and I think 46 seconds, or was it 8 minutes? 9 minutes, 49. There was a period of time, I think 8 minutes and 46 seconds or 9 minutes and 46 seconds. And then as I watched the service, I realized just how long that was. It's only when you actually time it that you realize the enormity of the situation, how cruel that was, how intentional. And in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, the upsurge was inevitable. People had to demonstrate because it touched a nerve. And I'm happy that for the first time, I think I saw that it touched a nerve in all sections of the United States of America. It was very surprising and very pleasant to see that the Black Lives Matter movement and the demonstrations and the marches were, I would say, 50-50 whites and Blacks.
Yes.
Because the issues that were being addressed are not issues that can be solved only by Black people. We need the entire population. We need white people to actually come out and help to find a solution, to make the changes that are necessary if there's going to be any kind of progress. Black people can't do it alone. Because they've been demonstrating since the civil rights movement and before.
Yes.
And nothing changed. The police brutality continued and still continues to today. We watch and see if there will be any substantive change. And I hope there will be, but I think it was inevitable that there would be these kinds of demonstrations. In terms of the United Church and the stand that they're taking, I am so proud of our church that they are saying, making this statement and making this pledge that they want to address it. I've ever been so happy since coming to Saskatoon that I've become a member of St. Thomas Wesley, because I've learned so much. I learned so much about the treatment of Indigenous people. I've learned about, our affirming program and the whole justice-seeking intentions of the church and the attempts at reconciliation and seeking justice for all. And that's something to me. I've been in churches before in Ontario. I never encountered a church that actually puts that intention in the forefront. And this is what has endeared me to the United Church and to St. Thomas Wesley in particular. I am so happy. I was always accepted. I've always felt like I was accepted. And I'm just proud and happy to be a member of that congregation and that church. So I'm very pleased with the efforts that are being made.
Well, thank you, Barb. That is encouraging to hear, and I think we all need to be witnesses of hope. And I think you've given me already, I think, a glimpse of your hopes, and I just think it's a great privilege that I've had to have you involved in this dialogue today, and I certainly thank you for doing that. And indeed, it's been a great privilege to have you as a friend at St. Thomas Wesley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like I said, I feel so accepted and I felt so at home in the congregation, and
yes,
and I just want to say, let us keep going. Let us keep the fight for justice. Let's keep at it, because you have to wear it. It's like a stone. You have to wear away at it. It has to erode, and because we're fighting against a system that's been institutionalized.
right.
And it's not an easy task, but the work has to be done. And I'm thanking all of you in the United Church and in St. Thomas Wesley who continue to work towards that. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be part of this.
Thank you.